In this session, we're going to take a look at service monitoring in EventSentry that's part of system health. Now, why is service monitoring important? First of all, service monitoring covers both services and drivers. And with drivers, I don't just mean hardware drivers for things like your graphics card and so forth, but also drivers that are utilized by enterprise software and monitoring software. For example, drivers for network capture, some of the sys-internal tools, also install drivers and so forth. So that's all covered in EventSentry with service monitoring. And there's really two benefits you get from service monitoring. The first one is the obvious one. You have a complete inventory and status overview of every service and driver in your entire infrastructure. So you know which services exist, and you also see any activity, services that are being added, removed, started, stopped, and so forth. It's also important for observing and monitoring critical softwares. So if we are talking about database services, SQL Server, Exchange Server, etc., you want to make sure these services are running. And sometimes you don't get any error messages that you just realize, oh, the service is stopped. Well, without monitoring these services with an application like EventSentry, you will not know that these services are suddenly stopped, for example. The other benefit is security. So of course, you want to know if a service is added or removed, or if critical services are being stopped or started. And that is especially true for drivers as well. So malware may be installing a driver in the background that monitors network traffic, or it may disguise itself as a service. So it's really important to know which services you have on your network and get alerted when services are added, for example. And finally, service monitoring also includes the ability to control services. So you can specify services and their desired state. Usually the desired state will be running. So you could say, okay, I have this service that continuously crashes or it's very unreliable. You can tell EventSentry to always keep that service running, for example. But let's take a look at the actual service monitoring functionality itself. Service monitoring is enabled by default in EventSentry, and you'll find it under System Health, Services. We're going to expand that and take a look at services. It's a global package, so this will be applied to all of your servers and workstations. And this will also cover Linux machines or non-Windows machines that have or support the concept of daemons if you have SSH support. So looking at this dialog from the top, we have a few options here. So the default option here is that we inventory all services, but that we exclude the listed services from alerts. Because again, there's two things you can do with service monitoring. One is simply keeping an inventory of them, which means they'll be available in the web reports. And the other one is an alert. And you don't want to get too many alerts about service activity because there is, generally speaking, a lot of service activity on any given Windows system, whether that's a workstation or a server. So what we do by default is we inventory all services, but we exclude a number of services from alerts. The advantage of this option is that you still have a full activity log, a full audit trail of all service activity, but you only get alerted for certain services. The other option, and that used to be the default prior to version 5.1, is monitor and alert on all services and exclude listed. It's similar, but what happens in this case is that any service that's listed down here is completely excluded from monitoring. So you will not see that service in the web reports anymore, and you will not be able to tell, okay, is a service installed, was there activity, and so forth, because sometimes that can be important. So this option is generally speaking to be preferred because you still have an inventory of all these services, you have an audit trail, but you just won't get any email or otherwise alerts from it. There's two more options. Only monitor listed, so this would be the opposite. So in this case, you're saying I only want to monitor these services. So if you have a very specific use case for EventSentry and say you have 3 services that you want to monitor, you don't care about any other services, that's okay. Then you can choose that option. In that case, you'll specify the services here, and anything that is listed here will be monitored. And disable, well, as the name implies, disables monitoring of services will completely turn this feature off. And you may wonder, so I'm going to say no here because I want to keep this here. And you may wonder, why would you do this? Well, you would do this if you're only utilizing the first service status functionality. So this is where you tell EventSentry you want a certain service to have a certain status, usually running. To add a service to this list, you simply hit the plus icon, and you can choose a service from the list. What we're showing here are the actual service display names and not the service key names. So if we look here in this dialog here, you'll see that we have two columns, the service display name. So this is what you see when you open up the services application in Windows. So let's take a look here at some of these services. Some good, back at the printer is the best example really. So here we have a service called print spooler. So what we see is print spooler, but if we open it up and we look at the actual service name, the service name is just spooler. So it's generally recommended that whenever you specify a service name to be included or excluded, either way, that you specify the service name that we refer to the service key name. So instead of the display name. This is particularly important if you're adding a service that does not exist on this computer, because EventSentry won't be able to resolve a service that it doesn't see on this host. So if you wanted to be excluding the spooler service, we could simply add spooler here, and if we go to the very bottom, we'll see that it resolved it to print spooler. If that spooler service were to not exist on this computer, but only on a remote monitored computer, then it would simply say spooler here. And you can see that with some of the other services here. DAM, for example, it knows about. This is a service that's installed on this computer, but the other ones are not installed. Like Skype Update, for example. That's a service that's not installed, so there's no display name. I'm going to remove this again with the minus button. Let's move down with the options here. So monitor service status changes. That obviously means we want to know when a service changes from running to stopped, from running to stop pending, and so forth. And here's the severity with which we log it to the event log. You could change this to warning or error if you feel like it's more important than just information. Windows, of course, has the concept of auto start services. So we see that here in the startup type. So if we look, for example, here, this service here, the Remote Access Connection Manager. So that's a service that's started automatically. So what this option here says, when auto start service or driver remains stopped, log error event every 30 minutes. So if Windows starts and this a service that is set to automatic is stopped, so it's not running, the EventSentry will log an error every 30 minutes saying this auto start service is not running. Monitoring service addition and removal. Again, if a service or driver are added or removed, then we want to monitor this. So this checkbox controls that. And then we have the monitor drivers options as well. So if you want to monitor drivers, which I recommend, then you would check this box. And drivers really work the same exact way in terms of their status and everything, and having a display name and a key name and so forth. The only difference is that they're drivers and not services, but they're essentially managed in the same way. Down here we have the database where we want to write our inventory to. So this is the primary database by default. And then we have a few advanced options. First one being on startup, check if services set to auto are running. So that's disabled in this case, but you would still be getting the alert every 30 minutes when that happens, but there won't be a single alert logged by EventSentry listing all services that are set to automatic start but are not running. You can enable that. And here is a delay. By default, it's 4 minutes, where EventSentry waits a certain time period before it starts monitoring services. So since the order of services is determined by Windows, it's very possible that EventSentry gets started before many of the other services are started. And you would be getting a lot of service status changes, alerts reported, which is usually considered a false positive. So with a 4-minute delay, we can make sure that we give Windows 4 minutes time to start all its services, and then we start monitoring services ourselves. You can tweak this period, make it higher to 5-6 minutes, or reduce it as well. Kind of something that depends on the server environment, but 4 minutes is usually a pretty safe number. And then down here we have the for service status. So this is again very simple. We simply specify a service here and the desired state. So I can go here and say print spooler, and I want to say running. So if we do that, then EventSentry is going to continuously monitor the service. Well, it monitors all services anyways. And if it finds that the print spooler is stopped, then it will try to start it, and it will log any sort of changes with the severity. So I'm going to just set this to error here, or maybe warning, because it seems pretty important when a critical service is stopped. Now Windows has a similar functionality in the actual Service Control Manager itself, called the recovery option, but that generally only applies if the service actually fails, if the service crashes. If you stop the service, then that won't have any effect here. So EventSentry's option is a little more basic. It doesn't really matter how the service stops or why it stops. So even if you manually stop that service, it's going to basically start it. And we can see that in action. If I go up here and save and deploy this configuration, then we should see an alert pretty soon. I've got a couple of events here. The state of spooler was stopped. The requested state is running. EventSentry successfully changed the service status to running. And there's a couple of events here. It looks like it was logged at the same time. But if we now look at the Service Control Manager, we can see that the service is running now. If we stop it again, it looks like it may have started it already that quickly. So it's pretty efficient, and will change the status immediately. So you can see that if you have EventSentry controlling that service, there's little time that passes before it starts it again. And you can see a number of 108 events here, basically indicating that the service was changed to running. Let's take a look at the EventSentry web reports and the service information we have in there. So if we go to features, again, services are under health right here, and a couple of options, of course, as is the case with many of the features. We have a current and a history, so we're going to just go to current here, and there's a few things we can do, of course, now, but we have a great overview here as to the number of services we have. So in this networking infrastructure here, we have 46 hosts and about 16,000 services, so definitely not something that you want to keep track of manually. But there's a few really interesting things you can do. So for example, you can see all the user accounts the services are running under. So for example, you can see that there's only one service running under the AD monitor account. You can see a special driver account here, local system, and so forth. But if you had custom service accounts here, it would be very easy to filter based on those, right? So this is usually something that you see pretty often in any network environment, custom service accounts that you have. So if you want to basically drill down and see, okay, well, which services are running under this account in case you have to change the password and so forth, then it's very, very easy to do that very quickly. For example, I can click this button here, and I can see immediately, okay, so these are the services that use this service account. You can click on detailed, of course, and see more information. You get all the information here. Okay, this is a driver, the availability, the executable, description of the service, and so forth. But going back to, I'm just going to go back here to the services, startup types. So we could see all services that are set to automatic, and we can even see all services that are currently stopped, even though they're set to automatic. We can see that most of them are drivers. So we're going to say, well, we want to see the services that are not drivers. And here we have a complete list of 92. So that's the total count that we have services running in this environment that are not running. And we can further reduce this. We can say, okay, we don't care about the Docker groups. So let's remove those. And now this leaves us essentially with two machines. We have a Linux Ubuntu machine that seems to have a lot of services or daemons that are set for automatic start. So let's exclude that as well. And that really leaves us one. There's this maps broker service, clearly not very important, not critical, but that's the only service that we have that is set for automatic startup that's currently stopped. Now, of course, this is not a critical service, no question about it. But if you had a critical service on your network that you wanted to find, then you can do that very, very quickly with EventSentry. Whereas if you were to use scripts, PowerShell, or do this manually, it would take you a pretty long time if it was even feasible to do that at all. Going back again to the services, we can also use some charting. So for example, if we click on the computers icon here, we can see a visual representation. So we can immediately see which computers have the most services. So the Windows 11 machine and the 2022 machines here are clearly the winners with about over 500. Well, all of them have over 500, but clearly the Windows 11 machine with over 600 is the winner here. And we can go back here. We can also take a look at the service history. So again, we go here. By default, we see the last 24 hours. There seems to be a lot of activity, so I'm going to reduce this to the last maybe 30 minutes. Now we're down to 154. And I'm going to switch to details. And here we are with all the service status changes. And we can see that there's definitely a lot just within the last few minutes. Let's make this a little bigger here. From 6:04 p.m. to 6:01 p.m., we already have about 15-20 status changes. And again, if we identify services that change frequently that we don't want to see on there, we can do the same thing. And we can definitely see which services are very active. Windows Modules Installer, we'll just remove that. Windows Update, we'll just remove that. And now we're down to still a lot, but much fewer. And now we can see that some of the changes that we made, for example, the print spooler that was basically started on that workstation because I had added it to that package, same on some of the other machines. But again, there's a few more that we don't really need. Network setup service, that's not something we really need to see. Of course, we've got the software protection service, device setup manager, those are all services we don't really need to see. And back to devices, now we have a bit of a better view here of what's going on. We can also see in the chart here during which time most service activity occurred. But you can see how easy it is to navigate through this inventory and kind of drill down and find relevant information.